I want to welcome everyone today for our class on Joshua and Judges. This is our 14th class period, and we are studying now in the book of Judges. We are in the 3rd chapter. And while I'm not with you this morning, I'll be traveling from Nashville to Certs, Texas, or just outside of San Antonio, for the lectureship there, having just finished one in Murfreesboro. We are glad that you're here. In studying the 3rd chapter of Joshua, we had been going through the section on Othniel, which begins in verse 1 and goes through verse 11. And in that first oppression, we learn and know who the oppressor is, Mesopotamia. The judge, number 2, was Othniel. The third thing we learned was that they were oppressed for 8 years. And the fourth thing that we learned was that they had rest for 40 years. With those 4 things, knowing all 4 of those things with this first oppression, we want to give in addition that we do not always know all 4 of those elements. The judge is always given, but it does not give many times who the oppressor is. Sometimes it does not give us who the oppressors are, how long they were oppressed, nor sometimes does it give how long that they had rest. But we do see that those are the elements that are involved in all of this. In verses 12 through verse 30 now, we enter into the second judge of Israel, that is Ehud, and his saving Israel from Moab, the Moabites being the second oppressors. So after the death of Othniel, who was the first judge, we see in verse 12 that the people return again to their evil. Again, we would notice that in relationship to Othniel, that while he was alive, the people remained faithful. There was that strong leader, that king, in a sense, of the Israelites, leading them, and because of that strong leadership, we see the people remaining faithful. But once he dies, we begin seeing the cycle that we have talked about starting again. And we would again emphasize the different points of that cycle. There is first the disobedience and departure from God. They once again do evil in the sight of the Lord. Well, there's that disobedience, the first step in that cycle. The second step in that cycle will be disaster for the people of God. This is when the oppressor comes in and the people are enslaved. The third is the people's desire for change. They cry out to God for deliverance. The fourth step in that cycle is the deliverance, that God raises up a judge to deliver them. And then the fifth step is once again dependence upon God, and in this we see a rest from their enemies, and that's what we've seen in the situation with Othniel. Now then we're beginning it again the second time with this second judge. So there is the turning to evil that they do. As a result, the second step of that cycle, God brings an oppressing nation upon them to oppress them. This time it was Eglon, king of Moab. And thus the Moabites come to oppress Israel. And this oppression taking place because, very simply, the evil that Israel was doing, engaged in. In verse 13, Eglon joins forces with the Ammonites and Amalek, and they took the city of palm trees. City of palm trees has reference to Jericho. Some say just outside of Jericho, but it would be in that area. Thus, the Moabites and the Ammonites descend from, or were descendants from the same ancestor, Lot, which also makes them distant relatives with Israel. Both of these, the Moabites and Ammonites, lived to the southeast of Canaan. In verse 14, the children of Israel served Eglon, or they were oppressed by Eglon and the Moabites for 18 years this time because of their evil. And in verse 15, we start seeing the next step. We've seen they turn away from God to do evil. They depart from Him. We see the oppression that comes upon them, the second step. Now then, the third step is seen in verse 15, that they cry unto Jehovah, and thus here is their desire for change on Israel's part. They very simply did not like being under oppression to this nation, and thus they cry to God for help. As a result of that, we see the fourth step in this, that God raises up Ehud as their deliverer, as their judge. Ehud was the son of Gera, of the tribe of Benjamin. And it mentions that he is a man left-handed. It seems as if the Benjamites might have all been left-handed, according to what we would see in Joshua 20 and verse 6. But the name Benjamin means son of the right hand. The right hand means strength or power. It represents that. But it appears as if these Benjamites were left-handed, although some think that Ehud had some type of deformity or injury to his right hand. And that enables him, they say later on, to deliver the children of Israel. Also, since they had taken the city of Jericho, it's interesting that Jericho would have been in Benjamin's territory. And thus God is raising up a judge from the very tribe where seems to be the central point of the oppression, which would be in the tribe of Benjamin. And Ehud is going to deliver a present to Eglon, and by means of that present, he is going to kill him. Verse 16, we start seeing the plans that are being made. That Ehud makes a dagger. This would be a short sword or a knife. It was about 18 inches long. This would be the total length of the knife or the dagger, which and some would possibly say it was just simply the length of the blade, but it was probably the total length of this dagger. It was double-bladed. In other words, it was sharp on both sides of the knife or the dagger, instead of, as many knives are today, simply sharp on one side. He hides it under his clothing so that it will not be seen, and it's on his right thigh. Since he is left-handed, it's going to make him easier for him to reach under and to grab the dagger, and thus easier to get to. It would be very different if he had been right-handed, and since apparently most people were right-handed during this period of time, maybe having it also taped to his right thigh it would be easier to conceal from the guards of Eglon. Verse 17, he brought this present to Eglon. And the name Eglon means literally fat ox. Fat ox. And thus he is described as being very fat. The name Eglon being very apropos to the type of individual that he is. The word present, that Ehud brings a present to Eglon, can mean taxes. And since they were subject to and being oppressed by the Moabites here and by Eglon, it would be very reasonable for them to have to pay taxes to the Moabites and to Eglon. And so very possibly here is Ehud bringing these taxes as one nation under subjection to another nation, bringing these taxes to give to Eglon. In verse 18, Ehud sends away those who had carried the present, and again, that possibly being the taxes, and he sending them away would enable them to make their escape prior to this execution that Ehud is going to give or perform on Eglon. And thus they would be far away and they would be out of danger. It appears in verse 19 as if Ehud was leaving when it states that he turned again from the quarries that were by Gilgal. The quarries refers to the graven images. And so it appears as if he's leaving, and as he's going by these graven images, he is emboldened to perform this deed that he has planned in killing Eglon. And so he returns to tell Eglon that he has a secret errand or a message for him. Eglon falls into the trap, we see there in verse 19, and he tells him to keep silent. Don't tell him this secret message, and this allows him to send everyone out, and that way the message that Ehud is going to tell him is going to remain secret to just the two of them. And so he sends everyone out. In verse 20 then, Ehud comes in, and as Constable explains, the room in which Ehud met Eglon, in verse 20, was on the flat roof of the house. Rooms built this way caught the prevailing currents of air and therefore provided a cool place of retreat from the hot weather. So here they are in this cool place, retreating from the hot weather, and Ehud tells Eglon that he has a message from God for him. Eglon gets up, apparently, to receive the message, arising out of his seat. As he does, verse 21, Ehud takes the sword that is in with his left hand. Again, he is one who is left-handed, and possibly Eglon did not know that Ehud would be able to do anything like this with his left hand. If most people being right-handed, thus there would not be that ability to use the left hand in the way that they would the right hand, and thus possibly he is totally unsuspecting and lets his guard down, especially if he has some type of deformity in his right hand, as some have supposed. Ehud then thrusts the dagger into his stomach area, his belly. verse 22, it states concerning the blade that it went basically all the way in. Again, Constable explains it this way, that it went all the way through Eglon's fat body. It apparently contained no crosspiece, hilt, between the handle and blade. The handle lodged in the fat, while the point opened a hole in his back where his excrement oozed out. And where it says there in verse 22 that the haft also went in after the blade, the haft actually would be the handle of the dagger. And so that entire dagger would be going into his belly, and that again points out how fat Eglon was. And it goes through him, and as the King James puts it, the dirt came out. The contents of his bowels come out. Verse 23, upon doing this, Eglon then very calmly leaves, shuts and locks the door behind him. He leaves through the port, shuts the doors, and locks them, thus preventing Eglon's servants from coming in. Well, verse 24, when he was gone out, his servants came. And when they saw that, behold, the doors of the parlor were locked, they said, surely he covereth his feet in the summer chamber. So as Eglon's servants come, but since the doors are locked, they thought that he was using the bathroom in a very discreet manner. It puts it that he covereth his feet in the summer chamber. That is, that he was having a bowel movement. So that's their thinking, and thus they, in order not to go in and embarrass the king, they remain outside with the doors locked. Verse 25, they continued to wait and wait, thinking that he's going to come out. But of course, he is dead, and so he's not coming out, and they're continuing to wait. This, of course, is going to allow Ehud to escape. Finally, since he did not come out, they get the key, verse 25, unlock the doors, and finally discover that he's dead. But as we mentioned, verse 26, the delay by the servants in thinking that here he is using the restroom, and we certainly don't want to go in and disturb that. We don't want to get involved in that or embarrass him in any way. Thus, that delay allows the time for Ehud to escape past the quarries, again, those idols, and to Seirah. Now, no one is sure where Seirah is. Some have supposed that it might have been northwest of Gilgal in Ephraim's hill country. But in reality, no one really knows where that is, where that city is. Verse 27 now, Ehud blows a trumpet for the children of Israel to follow him in attacking the Moabites. Their king is now dead, and thus the time to attack is right now. And that's what Ehud recognizes. The time is now. Let's catch upon the time and go down, and we can destroy the Moabites at this time. If you wait, they will regather their forces, and we won't be able to defeat them. And so he, in a sense of urgency here, blows the trumpet, and they go down with him, and he leading them in that fight. Verse 28, he tells them very clearly, follow after me. So he is that leader now in Israel, and they were to follow him. But notice that he recognizes that it's not because of their power or their strength that they're going to be delivered. Notice they says that the Lord, or for the Lord, hath delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. So it was God who was delivering the Moabites. It wasn't their strength and their power by which they were being delivered. It was God doing this for them. Now, God was doing it through them. He wasn't doing it directly, but he was doing it indirectly through providential means and the leadership of Ehud and what Ehud was doing. But the power resided with God. It says that they went down after him and took the fords of Jordan toward Moab and suffered not a man to pass over. In other words, they took the fording place of Jordan. This would be where the Moabites would cross over Jordan, as again they had taken this city of palm trees, Jericho. Thus they were on the western side of Jordan, yet Moab was on the eastern side of Jordan. Thus they would need to go back across Jordan. Well, the place where they would ford that Jordan River, across the Jordan River, Israel now comes down and they take that fording place. And this would close the border between the two nations to make it where the Moabites could not flee back home to Moab, as they would have done if the Israelites had not taken this city. And so it also prevents any of the Moabites who would have been on the east side to come back over to fight against Israel. Verse 29 then, they slew of Moab at that time 10,000 men. As we noticed last week, the idea of 1,000 can mean military units, and some say that that's the idea that's being expressed here, that Israel killed 10 military units of men. Probably, though, 1,000 is correct, and thus they killed 10,000 men. And it states that all of the men were lusty, that is, they were fat. And they were also men of valor. It states that they were men of valor, that is, they were strong. They were men of ability in fighting the battle. And then it also says in verse 29 that there escaped not a man. So Israel did not allow any of the Moabites to escape this slaughter. They killed all of them. Then in verse 30, Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years. So Moab is subdued, and they have rest for 80 years. Thus we have come to an end of this second cycle that we have seen in this cycle of events. Again, in this second cycle, we have all four elements being set forth for us. We're told that the enemy, first off, is Moab. So there's the enemy, one. Number two, we're told who the judge is. The judge is Ehud. The third thing we're told is that of the oppression and how long it lasts. It lasted 18 years, and after those 18 years, that's when the Israelites cried to God for deliverance. The fourth thing that we're told in that cycle is that they had rest for 80 years. Thus, we are given all of those aspects of this second oppression, or this second cycle. Now, in the third cycle, and thus the third judge, we're not given all that much detail. In fact, verse 31 is the only verse which records this. And this is Shamgar. He is the third judge. And thus, in verse 31, Shamgar saves Israel from the Philistines with an ox goad. Is that how we would entitle this section? Verse 31, and after him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, which slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. So here's the third judge. He is also mentioned in chapter 5 and verse 6 of Judges. But other than these two, we really don't know anything about him. This is all that's recorded for us. It does mention that he's the son of Anath. It mentions that he killed 600 Philistines. It tells us how he killed, or with what instrument he killed the Philistines, and that is with an ox goad. An ox goad is a pointed stick, often with a metal tip, a pointed metal tip, that would be used to prod the oxen, to prod animals, to get them to go where you wanted them to go. It would be about 8 to 10 feet long. And with the use of that ox goad, Shamgar delivered Israel. Also, in this situation with Shamgar and the Philistines, no one else is mentioned as far as helping Shamgar. And so it's very possible that Shamgar did all of this single-handed. And thus, some have also speculated, and very possibly, that the 600 Philistines that he killed were not all at one time, which would seem reasonable, but instead were over a period of time. Also, some individuals speculate that this was during the 98 years described in the previous section, with the deliverance from Moab by Ehud. You had 80 years of rest along with 18 years of oppression, thus making 98 years. And some would say that Shamgar was more of a localized judge and not so much over the entire area, and that this took place during that 98-year period of time. Others have placed the time of Shamgar as contemporary with Deborah, who is the next judge that we read about in chapters 4 and chapter 5. While with the first two cycles we're told who the enemy is, we're told who the enemy is here also. Here it is the Philistines. We're told the second point who the judge is, in this case Shamgar. However, there are some things we do not know. We do not know the length of the time of the oppression, nor do we know the time of rest, where those 2 points are set forth with the first 2 judges. They are not mentioned at all in regards to this judge of Shamgar. Concerning the Philistines, Constable writes that the Philistines had been in Canaan since Abraham's day, at least, according to Genesis 21:32 and other passages. He goes on, however, during the period of the Judges, a major migration of the sea peoples from the Aegean area brought many new inhabitants into Canaan, perhaps about 1230 BC. These people settled in the coastal areas of Canaan, especially in the south. They became the infamous Philistines who opposed and fought the Israelites until David finally brought them under Israel's control. Thus, these Philistines really become a major thorn in Israel's side. And we again go back to the aspect, if Israel had done what God commanded them to do in driving out the nations, the Philistines never would have bothered them. But because of Israel's failure to do what God says, they have all of these problems in what they are doing and throughout their lives and throughout their history. It should teach us that great and important lesson that we always do what God says, and that God's way is always the best way. It will be prosperous for us when we do what God says to do. And sometimes we tend to forget that, thinking that we can be successful by failing to do what God says or by refusing to do what He says. And that very simply is not the case. Success is going to be when we do what God says. The next two chapters, chapters 4 and 5, then, we have Deborah and Barak deliver Israel from the Canaanites. Deborah and Barak deliver Israel from the Canaanites, chapters 4 and 5. In chapter 4, verses 1 through verse 3, we have apostasy, servitude, and oppression of Israel by Jabin. Apostasy, servitude, and oppression of Israel by Jabin. Verses 1 through 3 of chapter 4. After the death of Ehud, the cycle starts again. The children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord when Ehud was dead. So they start the cycle again. And again, we would notice in this, because of Ehud's influence, Israel had remained faithful to God during this previous time. It's when Ehud dies that they once again do evil in the sight of God. We again emphasize, and it is emphasized to us over and over again, how important good leadership is. And we talked a little bit last time about the need in appointing elders to make sure that we appoint strong elders who will lead us in the right way. So many times we appoint elders who simply are not qualified for the job, and as a result of the weak eldership, the congregation falls off into apostasy. And that's what we're seeing here as well. They lack good leaders. Ehud was a good leader, but Israel remained faithful to God. When he dies, though, they start the cycle again by leaving God and doing evil in His sight. Verse 2, in this cycle, God brings up an enemy to oppress them. And the fourth oppressor in this cycle was that of the Canaanites, and their king, Jabin. It's interesting that the name Jabin means discerning. So he was one who was given that idea of there was discernment with that individual. It's possible that Jabin is not a proper name, but instead is the title of the king. Kind of like Pharaoh in regards to Egypt. Pharaoh was the title of the king of Egypt. It applied to whoever was ruling at that time. Well, so Jabin appears to be a title and not a proper name. Sisera, we are also introduced to him. Well, he is the leader of the army for Jabin. Jabin being the king, Sisera the military leader. Sisera lives several miles to the southwest of Hazor in Harosheth. Harosheth means the woodlands of the nations. The woodlands of the nations. Hazor is one of the largest cities of the Promised Land. And their capital would have been on the road connecting Egypt and Mesopotamia. So it was a centralized location and one of importance in relationship to travel and trade, since it connected Egypt and Mesopotamia. And thus, that because of that centralized location, that important location, it becomes one of the largest cities of the Promised Land. In verse 3, we're told that the Canaanites had 900 chariots of iron. These chariots of iron gave them control over those areas of the plain, that land that would be flat, and thus it forced the Israelites to live in the mountainous areas instead of there in the plains, the flat area. We're told that Jabin and Sisera oppressed the children of Israel for 20 years, and it states that he mightily oppressed them. So this was a very heavy-handed oppression, apparently. It was not something that was very easy. It was a hard oppression. But for 20 years. Verse 4, now we are introduced to our next judge, and that is the fourth judge, Deborah. She is the fourth judge and the only woman judge of the 15 judges. And I will remind you, if you have not memorized the judges as of yet, you need to do that. I know that some of you have. And if you will, just write those down after your memory verse and send those to me. You need to be getting that done fairly soon, since we don't have a great number of classes left. You need to have those memorized. And I would encourage you that to go ahead, if you have the time, to memorize the chart that is in Bob Winton's outline commentary on page 2. It sets forth the enemy, the passage, how many years they are oppressed, the judge, and how long the judge rules. If you will memorize all of that, you will have a great overview of the judges. While I'm not requiring that, because I'm hesitant to require that much memory work, it would be a good thing for you to memorize. And if you do memorize the entirety of that chart, then I will, and you'll write it down for me and send it to me, I will give you extra credit for that. Although I really don't think there's hardly anyone that needs a lot of extra credit, but if you feel like you do, then go ahead and do that. But it would be good to memorize that chart, whether you do it for extra credit or not. Deborah is also described as a prophetess. There are 3 prophetesses that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Miriam is referred to as a prophetess in Exodus 15 and verse 20. Deborah here is mentioned as a prophetess. And the third prophetess would be Huldah, 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 who is mentioned in 2 Kings 22:14. There are a couple of other prophetesses, female prophets, mentioned in the New Testament. You have Anna, who is mentioned in Luke 2 and verse 36, the prophetess Anna. And then in Acts the 21st chapter, verses 8 and verse 9, you have Philip's 4 daughters who prophesied. And thus, while not termed prophetesses, since they did prophesy, they would be in that role of a prophetess. She is also a wife, and she is also a judge. She is the wife of Lapidoth, and she judged Israel at that time. It's interesting that here's a lady who was able to combine three aspects: being a prophetess, being a wife, and being the leader of Israel, a judge. And apparently she was able to combine all three of these things and do each one of them well. There are many women today who are able to combine different aspects of their life and do all of them well. They might be a wife to their husband, a mother to their children, a homemaker in taking care of the home and making it the type of place that it needs to be and that will produce happiness and joy for the family, and to be able thus to train the children in the way that they should go and make that home a haven on earth. And yet these women are also have the ability to have a job outside of the home. They work within the home, but they also work outside of the home. And they are able to work well for the Lord and do the Lord's work and do all of these things well. Those women truly are a wonderful woman and the type of women that need to be around. If you look at the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31 and just see all of the attributes and all of the things that that virtuous woman does, then you start seeing an aspect of someone who is truly a hard worker. They're not lazy. They are homemakers, but they also do business work. Her children will rise up and call her blessed. Her husband is praised in the gate because of the type of woman that she is. And there is that virtuous woman also combining many different aspects of work and of duty and service and doing all of them well. And those truly are virtuous women, and their price is, as Solomon would say, far above rubies. They are precious, and we need to uphold them. And those women who decide to stay at home and make the home the center of their life, those women need to be praised. And sad to say, we have so many women today, and our society today denigrates those women who just stay at home, and they are as called just homemakers or housewives. And it's almost, we look down at our noses upon those women, and that's a shame, because that's the place that God places the wife and the mother. She is to be domestically oriented. That doesn't mean she cannot work outside of the home, but her emphasis should be the home and making that home what it should be. And the man is to go out and earn a living, to bring home the money and to provide for his family. And the wife there, making that home what it needs to be, does not prevent her from going outside the home and working, but her emphasis should be within the home. Well, you see that aspect of Deborah, as she is a wife here. And she is doing that, no doubt, well. Verse 5 then, it states that she dwelt under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel and Mount Ephraim, and the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. As we've noted in the introductory material to Judges, and as we've gone through the book of Judges so far, these judges were primarily military leaders. But Deborah was not only a military leader and did not only have that aspect of her life, but here she also was making judgments or decisions as what needed to be done. And so this verse presents her more from the standpoint of a civil leader, more so than a military leader. And notice the respect that she had from the people, because here the people are coming to her for judgment, for civil grievances is what it's talking about. So when two people get at odds, there's a disagreement, there's arguments between people or groups, they come to her to settle this for them. Shows the great wisdom that she must have had, but also the trust that the people had in her. But it also, and we would go back to the previous verse, she was a prophetess. Thus, in the decisions that she makes in those civil grievances that people have with each other, there's a divine guidance that she has in the making of those decisions. And likewise, as we go through this 4th and 5th chapter, in going through the events that are recorded here, we're going to see that divine guidance of Deborah as she leads the children of Israel in this battle. In verse 6, she sends and calls for Barak, the son of Abinoam, out of Kadesh Naphtali. And she says to him, "Hath not the Lord God of Israel commanded, saying, Go and draw toward Mount Tabor, and take with thee 10,000 men of the children of Naphtali and of the children of Zebulun." So now then she is pushing Barak to do what needs to be done. The name Barak means lightning. And it's interesting when we get to the end of this, and as we see the Song of Deborah in chapter 5, there's a little play on this, that Barak's name meaning lightning. So she, being a prophetess, is reminding Barak, here's what needs to be done. Here's what the Lord has commanded you to do. Also, we see in this that Deborah was an encourager of people. How we need, and we've stressed this in previous lessons, how we need to be encouraging others, because people get discouraged. And so we need to push them, encourage them to do what needs to be done, or what they should do. That's what Deborah is doing with Barak. She is there behind him, pushing him. We need to get behind people and push them, to encourage them. Do what's right. Do what God wants you to do. He was to go, and the word go there literally means to draw along, with his force of 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun, and then wait at the mountain. Verse 7, she is going to draw out Sisera, the leader of Jabin's army, along with his chariots and soldiers, to the Kishon River. And then she is going to deliver Sisera and the Moabites into Barak's hand for Barak to defeat them. Verse 8, though, Barak doesn't want to go alone. And he tells her, if you'll come with me, I'll go. Barak should have had the attitude, I'm going to do what God wants me to do no matter what. Doesn't matter whether she goes with me or not, I'm going to do what God wants me to do. But sadly, he didn't have that type of an attitude. He had the attitude, I'll only do it if you go with me. But if you don't go with me, I'm not going to do it either. I'm not going to go. And so, verse 9, Deborah agrees to go with him. But she says, it's not going to be to your honor. You're not going to be honored in this. It's going to be instead of to a woman's honor. and that God is going to deliver Sisera not into the hands of Barak, but into a woman's hand. And we learn as we read through this that God did not deliver him into Deborah's hand, but it was into another woman's hand, that being Jael. Well, our first hour is up, and so we'll end here and then begin at this point in our next